subscriber of mine once asked me, "Your profile says you wear many hats, but where are the hats?" Now, with the exception of the Cletus Van Damme hat, the hats are mostly metaphorical. However, I have a bit of a confession to make. Yeah, there, okay? I own one of these. Now, when I first bought this hat 4 or 5 years ago, there were essentially no modern social connotations to it. Everything about the hat harkened back to bygone eras. And what I had in mind was something like this. This is a picture of my grandfather, 1946, in Brooklyn with my uncle. Now, some of you might be thinking, wow, that's amazing. Your grandfather was a Brooklyn hipster decades before there were Brooklyn hipsters. And that's not what I'm trying to point you to here. These hats, and hats in general, used to be much more common. Fedoras, Tribleys, and then at some point they just sort of fell out of favor. Now, often I wish that I had majored in sociology, because when you find yourself pondering questions like, how does a hat fall out of favor in culture and just disappear? Or how does a hat style become associated with a certain type of person? Do we associate fedoras with Prohibition-era gangsters because the gangsters actually wore them, or because that's the way they were depicted in Hollywood films? Then you really start to wonder whether or not you majored in the right thing in college. One thing that I noticed in the James Bond movies is that when you look back at the Sean Connery and even the first few Roger Moore movies, that he has a hat, and he goes into M's office and he has this banter with Moneypenny, and he tosses his hat on the coat rack. And this is a reoccurring scene in the Sean Connery movies and in a couple of the Roger Moore movies, and then it just disappears. Like, the hat just sort of disappeared from culture when it used to be a common thing. How does that happen? I mean, it must be sometime in the mid-70s that this started to happen, if it disappeared from James Bond movies around that time. But I'm not some cultural expert on hats. And then it reappeared several years ago, or a few years ago, and it took on the worst possible social connotations. Not initially, though. Initially, people just started, oh, cool, this is vintage hat, I'll wear this. But then, you know, you have things like fedoras of OkCupid, where wearing this sort of hat, a fedora or a Triblee, essentially becomes an invitation to be mocked and ridiculed. Women say that it's a deal breaker if a man even has a picture of himself in one of these sorts of hats. You are stereotyped as a socially awkward, entitled nerd with relationship problems, who complains about being forever alone and is branded a nice guy. And going back to the whole why didn't I major in sociology thing, I'm really fascinated about how that cultural process happens. How it goes from one sort of connotation and image of something, and it transforms through things like social media into something else. And it's sort of stupid to stereotype people based on what kind of hat they have. And then again, in some ways, it's not. That's one of the fascinating things about clothing, is that clothing says quite a lot about a person. It can indicate social status. It can indicate things about their interests. It can identify them as a member of a subculture or an ethnic group or a religion. And we place quite a lot of emphasis and significance on clothing. And that, to me, that whole process is fascinating. But one day, and it will probably be years from now, some scholar is going to write a book on how the fedora became this despised object of fashion and associated with nice guys. And I think I would probably like to read that book.